Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marc Nucup. I am a public historian at the Mariners Museum, and welcome to this virtual presentation. It is part of a larger research project I've been working on, and at the suggestion of my supervisor, I wanted to share some of the things I've discovered in the research as I'm going along before perhaps in a few months, we'll see a larger virtual presentation come from me covering more aspects of colonial maritime history, as it were. But today's presentation is going to be covering roughly a 200-year-ish sort of period, 180 or so years. And I want people to keep in the back of their minds that, you know, fashion and people changed over that time. Particularly, you have English sailors in the mid to late 1600s on the left there are becoming British and then American sailors by the late 1800s. So it's a difference in appearance, but not necessarily a difference in attitudes. But the artwork that I'm using to illustrate this comes from all over the time periods and may not be an accurate representation of some of the specific events and some of the specific participants. So I wanted to have that in the back of your mind as we go along. And I also want people to keep in their mind that there is a reputation that sailors have as being quarrelsome and difficult, if not outright riotous on occasion. And this reputation plays into the period of history and the events we're looking at, because it was for the mariner the response that they might make to difficulty, to problems, and it had some wide-ranging political implications. But most of all, this is a story of regulation, resistance, accommodation that would result in more resistance to every regulation that comes afterwards. And because there was success in accommodation, getting certain legislative acts ameliorated or changed, the resistors were emboldened to continue to resist when there was something that they perceived as an infringement upon their livelihoods or their rights. All of this is occurring within the British mercantile system. And here's a British merchant now. The idea of a mercantile system is that the economy of an imperial power, that is a country that holds colonies overseas usually, is a closed system, a relatively closed system, a closed economy, that the colonies are there to produce raw materials for the mother country, who would then change those raw materials into manufactured goods or luxury goods, and then sell those to their population as well as the population in the colonies, who are consumers providing income and money to the mother country. And this is colonial Virginia, who plays an important part of the story of this. Even though there wasn't any major port like Boston or New York or Philadelphia or even Annapolis in Virginia, Hampton Roads itself, with its tributaries along the Chesapeake Bay, had numerous small ports that employed a decent number of sailors and mariners and chandlers and stevedores, who all relied upon maritime trade for their livelihood. The Navigation Acts are a series of British legislation, British laws that defined what goods could be shipped between England, later the United Kingdom, and its colonies, for example, Yorktown here, and how and where those goods could be shipped. And the first Navigation Act was in, well, let's back up just a little bit. The very first of the Navigation Acts is an act touching on political considerations for the maintenance of the Navy, 1563. I'm sorry, let me back up one more. A little bit of a timing issue there. So the Navigation Acts were really pretty successful in generating revenue for the mother country, for Britain, as well as controlling overseas trade. What sort of exports and specie was leaving the mother country and the colonies and going outside of the closed colonial system. But Americans resisted these limitations because staying within the closed British economy meant that there were opportunities to make money with the Dutch, with the French, in Africa that colonial American merchants could not participate in. And the Navigation Acts, their primary goal was to generate taxes, revenue for the mother country, but those taxes were paying for things like security of the colonies. We have a British warship here in the port of Yorktown. So those ships protected from foreign invaders. Early on, they protected from pirates. They caught smugglers. They provided life-saving in some cases, as well as police and law enforcement authority. Those are big deals, and the Parliament, the Admiralty, needed money in order to pay for all of those things. So 1563, this act established impressment. Impressment was necessary for the Royal Navy because of a constant shortage of manpower for during wartime. Pay conditions in the Royal Navy were low and miserable. Therefore, it was very unusual to have large amounts of volunteers who would serve in the Royal Navy. And on top of all of that, if you were pressed, taken up, and forced to serve in the Royal Navy, you were not guaranteed a date of discharge because the press could be for the duration of the war. And that's a problem for England and then the United Kingdom, because between 1563 and 1776, Britain is at war for, well, they have 22 foreign wars and some domestic and civil wars. So out of the 213 years between 1563 and 1776, there's only 52 years of peace. So the Royal Navy needed a massive amount of sailors, and they had to take them when there were no volunteers forthcoming. So that is what the press was. Now, being pressed or impressed into the Navy actually is a centuries-old process dating back to the 1300s, but the 1563 Act actually legalizes, formalizes, codifies the actual act of doing that. Most press occurred between ships at sea. A Royal Navy vessel would stop a merchant vessel and purportedly hunt for Royal Navy deserters. Initially, that's who would be subject to the press. However, given the way that the law was initially written and given the discretion that Navy captains were given, they would take any sort of sailor or passenger who had a particular set of skills that they may have needed on their vessel at that time, a carpenter, a blacksmith, something like that. Or if they just needed manpower, they could take any of the able-bodied sailors from the merchant vessel. Now, this was not popular, obviously, with merchant vessel owners, merchant vessel captains, because you were actually potentially leaving that ship shorthanded, and that could endanger or certainly inconvenience that vessel. There was an expansion to the initial act in 1563, and that was the Vagrancy Act of 1597. This allowed for press gangs to begin going ashore and taking vagrants, term for the unemployed back then, into the Royal Navy. Now, the Royal Navy quickly abused this latitude that they were given, and they were taking drunks who were unable to defend or protest out of taverns. They would take sailors who did not have adequate IDs identifying that they were properly employed. They also were taking landsmen who had no maritime skills whatsoever. And they were also taking married men, as kind of illustrated here in this particular engraving, who were supposed to be exempt from the press. And then we get the first formal Navigation Act on top of this tradition of pressing sailors, an act that sailors and maritime communities actively could resist to a degree, but certainly it was unpopular. So the Navigation Act of 1651 firmly establishes that mercantile principle of mother country supported by colonies, colonies supporting the mother country. All exports from the colonies had to pass through an English port before going to any foreign harbor. When they would reach that port, an English harbor, when they went to England from the colonies, even if they were destined for France or somewhere else, they would be stopped, inspected, and then duty, a tax, would be paid by the person who was producing all of those goods. All goods, and this prevented direct commerce, in theory, between the colonial ports and foreign powers. And this established a very important legal term, something that is still practiced by most maritime countries today, including the United States, and that is the principle of cabotage, which comes from the French for coastal sailing. All goods transported between colonial English ports had to be on English or colonial ships with English and colonial crews and passing between English and colonial ports. Again, for the United States, that is still true. For England, for the United Kingdom, it's still true. And like I said, most major countries practice this as well. The Navigation Act of 1660 was a restatement of the Navigation Act of 1651, which was promulgated under the Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell and Parliament running the country. The Navigation Act of 1660, restoration of King Charles II, basically restated the entire act. And they decided to keep the Navigation Acts. Parliament and Charles II here decided to keep the Navigation Acts in place because they were actually very successful at both generating revenue and preventing colonial merchants from trading with other countries. And then we have the Staple Act of 1663, and that is any goods that were picked up in foreign ports and destined for the colonies had to be, of course, brought to England first, but now they had to be unloaded, inspected, taxed this time by the buyer, the person in the colonies who would be accepting it, repacked, of course, onto an English ship, and then sent on to the colonies. This led to a massive increase, and this was purposeful. This led to a massive increase for foreign luxury goods in the colonies. And the reason why that was on purpose is England wanted the colonies, the American colonies, to buy all of the luxury goods directly from England instead of getting them from France or Spain or somewhere else. Another act in 1673 increased the penalties for goods illegally shipped from foreign ports, either those outright smuggled from a foreign country, from a Caribbean colony into the American colonies, or things that had not been properly surveyed in an English port before coming to the colonies. This meant that everything now had to kind of go through an English middleman who, again, would take his cut of the profits, increase the cost for colonials. But anything that was deemed illegal could be seized now for the crown. So instead of just paying a fine, you could lose your entire cargo, and in some extreme cases, your entire vessel. You notice I've been struggling with saying England and Britain. That's because it wasn't until 1707 when we have the Acts of Union, which unifies England and Scotland into the United Kingdom. This was not just a terminology thing and did not just change the flag. Now Scotland was no longer considered a foreign port. Colonial shippers could now send to Edinburgh or Aberdeen, any Scottish port, instead of having to stop in an English port. This was actually a benefit to colonial merchants and traders because Scotland had a long established relationship with France, and usually Scottish merchants could get more favorable terms with French merchants than going through English merchants. And then we have the Transportation Act of 1717. Now, this had a profound effect on labor in the North American colonies. By the time of independence, American independence, over 70,000 prisoners had been sent to North America to act as involuntary indentured servants. And one of the jobs that they could be indentured to was sailors. So not only did colonial American sailors risk being impressed, forced onto a Royal Navy ship, now their pay, their rate of pay was being undercut because these indentured convict servants who only had to be paid a small pittance, with most of their money going to the individual they were indentured to, be it a merchant or a shipmaster, they were being undercut by these convicts. And there's some very interesting reading if you look at the colonial Virginia gazettes and things like that, where people are very noticeably specifying there are runaway convict sailors and giving a description of them. The convict sailor had very little incentive to remain at the job and would try to jump ship in a colonial port and get away if possible. A regular colonial sailor had the incentive of getting paid at the end of a voyage, so there's no reason to jump ship. But for these convict sailors, that incentive was not there. So this affected the labor pool, particularly in the very large, in the larger southern coastal ports. And there's some convicts being shipped. The Molasses Act in 1733 outlawed trade between the European Caribbean colonies and the North American colonies. So this had been kind of a loophole that existed in the Navigation Acts, that colonial merchants could trade with other European Caribbean colonies because they were so close. They were on this side of the Atlantic. It doesn't make a ton of sense to have sent a colonial ship all the way to the United Kingdom, and then from the United Kingdom down to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean back to the United Kingdom, and then back to the colonies. Except in 1733, that's what they actually mandated. It was no longer possible to go directly from Boston or Yorktown to, say, St. Eustatius, the Dutch colony in the Caribbean. The reason why this was closed, this loophole was closed, was because of the sheer amount of smuggling occurring from the Caribbean colonies to the North American colonies. And that was untaxed income that the United Kingdom did not want to lose. We have the Plantation Act of 1740. This limited the press, to individuals who were over 18 and under 55, which makes you wonder what kind of problems, what kind of individuals was the press gang collecting and taking into Royal Navy service if they had to write a law that specifically said no one under 18 and no one under 55. All right, so all of these things have been piling one on top of the other, and I've been dumping them on you, one on top of the other, but it's starting to build up now. You have discontented sailors, discontented merchants. They are very circumscribed in where they can go, what they can do. There's competition from convict labor, English merchantmen, merchants acting as middlemen are taking a chunk of the colonial merchants' income, and shipmasters themselves are losing sailors every time there's a conflict with the United Kingdom and anyone else to the Royal Navy. And the first real large-scale manifestation of the discontentment in the colonies was the Knowles Riot of 1747. So when a Royal Navy squadron entered a larger harbor, they could take over 100 sailors. And it didn't have to necessarily actually be sailors. It could be landsmen, it could be the unemployed, it could be individuals who were drunk and unable to speak up for themselves. But this could actually crush the local economy, because not only were these individuals being taken out of circulation, especially if they already had another job, but whenever a Royal Navy squadron would show up, all of these sailors or anyone who thinks that they might be victimized by the press gang would scatter, and the local economy would just suddenly collapse because all these people were missing. And this affected profoundly Boston, America's largest colonial harbor, whenever a English Royal Navy squadron would show up. 1747, a squadron under Commodore Charles Knowles seized 46 Bostonians to be taken away. But the next morning, a mob of 300 local colonials began to riot. A colonial riot could be violent. It didn't necessarily have to be quite as violent as a contemporary riot. That's kind of a change in the terminology over the years. But it certainly was an angry mob imposing their will, because they capture a Royal Navy lieutenant in retaliation for the press gang taking the 46 individuals. The local sheriff and his deputies, who tended to avoid helping the press gang, even though they were required by law to, but they were locals. They did not want to anger the local population. They were forced, in this case, by a combination of the royal governor and by the royal and by Commodore Knowles, to arrest two of the mob. When the rest of the group heard of those arrests, they attacked the sheriff and forced the release of the two individuals who had been arrested. Now, a local politician, one of the town council, for lack of a better term, managed to get the Royal Navy lieutenant released. This lieutenant had been on shore leave. He wasn't actually part of the press gang, and took him to the royal governor. Now, the royal governor was incensed at all of this, because this resistance to the press gang, this resistance to the sheriff, was a resistance to royal authority. So he called out the local militia. When the local militia showed up, it promptly joined the mob. And the next day, the mob converged on the Capitol, where the governor and his council were trying to figure out what to do to defuse the entire situation. The mob only disperses after the governor promises to try and get the release of the 46 original individuals who had been pressed. During the negotiations, the mob had dragged a boat into Boston common and set it on fire, thinking that this was a Royal Navy boat. Turns out it was not. Hearing of these increasing acts of violence, the governor flees to the local British fort protecting the harbor, where he asks Commodore Knowles to finally release the pressed men. Knowles initially refuses, and in response says, if you cannot control the rioting, I will actually open fire on Boston. Apparently, the governor negotiates and pleads with Knowles throughout the night, and the next day, Knowles does indeed release the pressed men in return for a number of Royal Navy sailors who had been rounded up and imprisoned by the mob over the last few days. The governor was able to finally get some militia from outside of Boston to come into town and act as a police force, but the mob was actually fairly satisfied once the pressed men had been released, and they dispersed. Afterwards, for all of this tension, only 3 individuals would be fined. 3 of the Bostonians would be fined for their role in the Knowles Riot. Jump ahead a decade to the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. It was known in Europe, actually part of a larger world conflict, but the French and Indian War established the expansion of British North America through the conquest of New France. But because this was a global conflict occurring not just in North America, not just in Europe, but even as far as India and in the Caribbean, it was an expensive war resulting in a really high debt. And since chunks of the war had been fought in the colonies, New France, there was a desire to shift the cost via taxation to the North American colonies. However, the colonies maintained that the taxes they had been paying over the years, except for smuggling, within the entire mercantile system were their contribution to that war effort, aside, well, on top of the fact that American colonials had volunteered to serve in the war, both in the Navy and in the British Army. In 1764, the Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act, increased the penalties for violations between colonial ports for trading with any foreign or Caribbean ports. And there was an important side effect. Enforcement of customs duties moved from being a civilian job to a Royal Navy job. It was no longer a civilian contracted official who collected the taxes, the duties. It was going to be a Royal Navy officer. And for the first time in American colonial history, there was a permanent Royal Navy squadron established for North America. And this is the HMS Invincible, several times the flagship of that North American squadron. So the means at which the Parliament was trying to raise the taxes to pay for the debt from the French and Indian War first was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that a stamp be put on any piece of paper, printed or legal document, to make it official. So without a stamp, the document was not recordable. It wasn't a record. If you think about something like a diploma, that you graduated from a college and that you are professionally a lawyer or a doctor or a physician now, in order for that to be an official document, it was required to have one of these stamps. It was probably about only 25 to 30 cents, contemporary standards, but it was violently opposed because it was one more tax upon the colonies. And aside from the burning of the stamps, it was frequent that individuals who tried to affix the stamps would be prosecuted, persecuted, could be physically attacked, including up to and including tarring and feathering, which was a horrible, horrible experience. The tar that they're using was a naval store, so it's readily available in any sort of harbor port. It's used to make things waterproof, particularly lines and between lumber on ships. The Townsend Acts were a new or higher tax on any imported or manufactured goods coming to the United Kingdom from the colonies. This led to the very famous American boycott of those goods, if you've seen 1776. But the upshot was a massive increase in smuggling on small, fast, little vessels, as well as the nominally illegal manufacture of goods in the colonies of things like paper. The boycott was so successful that it was repealed by 1770. But smuggling still remained a huge issue. And in 1772, the HMS GASPEE was a small British sloop tasked with intercepting smugglers. However, the vessel ran aground and individuals, local individuals, this is off of Maine, local individuals, I'm sorry, this is off of Rhode Island. Local individuals dressed up as Native Americans and assaulted the crew of the Gaspee, eventually took them off of the ship and then burned this Royal Navy vessel. Despite cash rewards, no witnesses ever came forward during the investigation and no one was ever prosecuted. It was likely local merchants and sailors who burned the Gaspee. Unfortunately, I know I'm beginning to run late. I'm going to skip Somerset versus Stewart. That's going to be a big deal, and jump ahead to a big deal in a later lecture. But jump ahead to the Tea Act of 1773, which is what most people are familiar with. The British East India Company controlled the monopoly on tea in the empire, and they were facing bankruptcy. They were allowed direct access to the colonial American tea market, which was the #2 largest market for tea after the United Kingdom. And this was to undercut the cost of all that illegally smuggled tea into the colonies, and increase the amount of money that middleman British merchants could make. It was resisted, and in this engraving you can see actually by a sailor there, again with the tarring, the feathering, and the symbolism here is they're forcing tea down the throat of this particular tax collector. It resulted in the Boston Tea Party, where 30 to 130 locals dressed in native garb again boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor over 3 hours. As a result, the Coercive Acts in 1774 were passed as penalties, particularly against the people of Boston. Boston would be closed until the tea, approximately 9,000 pounds worth, that's a monetary figure, approximately $2 million in today's cash, was paid for, but by then it was too late. All of this culmination, dissatisfaction amongst mariners over the impressment over convict sailors, dissatisfaction with the merchants over having to trade through Britain and share their profits with British middlemen, dissatisfaction not being able to trade directly with Caribbean or European powers resulted in disgruntlement to the point that when incidents began to break out, again in Boston, which was closed by the British Army and the Royal Navy, that sailors and merchants were ready to embrace the rebellion that would follow. And I know that was radically fast and kind of trying to build a picture of how things hung together. It really doesn't do justice to the story. There are some sources for more information. If you happen to have access to the Journal of Economic History, the British Policy and Colonial Growth, Some Implications of the Burden of the Navigation Acts, by Roger Ransom, was published in September of 1986, and really started me with the idea of trying to build up a timeline of how things stacked on each other. But if you want something that's a little bit more accessible, that you can find at the library, The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic by Peter Limbaugh and Marcus Rediker. Marcus Rediker is an amazing historian, has worked a lot with the history of piracy. Beacon Press 2000 is a much more popular history. And I saw the chat go off several times, so if there are any questions, Tim, if we have any time for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. So yeah, again, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask those in the chat box. Or if you want to raise your hand, you can go ahead and do that as well.
I have one question from chat. It is from Stephen Park, and the question is there another talk focusing on Somerset? Gerald Thorne's research seems to indicate that rising taxes on enslaved people was at the heart of colonial resistance.
I'm not sure it was the heart. And there's, my goodness, that's a complicated and broad question. And I should have realized when I was trying to make a short lecture, I shouldn't have even mentioned Somerset. But again, it's such an important step. I don't have that yet. That is one of the topics that I'm working on. And the angle I'm coming at that from is how there are no slaves in the Royal Navy, and Somerset touches on that. So I haven't done it yet. It's a topic of research that is in a larger storyline for colonial maritime history I'm working on. And I can't even begin to address it now. But kind of watch the museum. I mean, it would be several months before I could address that, but there's something there, and I'm glad other people recognize it. That's awesome.
All right, so while we wait for any additional questions, I had a question.
Sure.
Was the quality of Sailor like any good if you're being impressed? Like, like how did this actually work out?
So if you were not a specialist like the carpenter, the blacksmith, or a gunner or something like that, there were kind of two general types of sailor. There was the able-bodied sailor, or seaman, as it'll eventually become known. And that's a trained individual who kind of knows what they're doing. Larger ships, not so much merchant vessels, though that could happen sometimes, but certainly larger warships had landsmen. These were individuals who were paid a smaller wage and really didn't know how to be a sailor. They could be trained to be a sailor, but on the really large warships and really large ships, you just needed hands to help pull lines, to help furl sails, to help stack, and shift cargo. So you didn't have to be a completely trained sailor in order to be useful on the ship. So when a press gang would stop or would stop another vessel, or would go on land and take up these untrained individuals, there was still a place for them in the hierarchy and job of running a vessel. But yeah, they weren't very good at that job, but sometimes you just needed hands.
Okay, great. As a follow-up to that previous question, it says here, The Counter-Revolution of 1776 is a book that I guess the NYU Press has that talks about that. So we have a hand raised. So
I'm sorry, was that Counter-Revolution?
The Counter-Revolution of 1776.
That is something I'm going to look at.
Awesome. So we have a hand raised here. So go ahead, Erica. If you could unmute yourself.
Great lecture, Mark. Small question, quick question. So if a sailor or non-sailor, I guess, was being impressed, possibly one that had like a family or relatives or something like that, could they appeal his, I don't know if impression is the correct term. And was there any type of process for that, or was it just very little that, and if anything, that they could do?
Well, there was stuff they could do. Now, I don't think I've seen a formal process in being able to make an appeal, particularly from the family. But the family, once they heard that their loved one had been pressed, could seek out the press gang, could seek out, their local political representative, could seek out a Royal Navy official and, state, hey, this guy is married, has kids, has a job, as well as the individual themselves being pressed could try to produce some sort of evidence or witnesses to say, hey, I'm not eligible for the press. But it depends on when it is. If it's, there's an act of war and the ship really, really needs hands, the Royal Navy's just not going to pay attention. They need the body more than they're willing to diffuse any sort of situation or if there's any hardship. And in theory, the pressed man was making money that he could send home. So, there's an idea that, Royal Navy officers could think, well, you're supporting your family anyway. But Royal Navy wages were horrible and stagnant and low. So it really wasn't a huge advantage. So no formal mechanism for appealing, though there were ways that they could appeal. They had to be more informal.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, that looks like the end of our questions at the moment. So thank you, everybody.
And thank you. I appreciate everyone who came. And again, a short shift, but I wanted to kind of show that there's a building up of things that all come together and will eventually culminate as part of the story of American independence. Thank you very much for attending another Mariners Museum presentation. It's great to still be able to reach out and interact with our audience.